Hello again. In this session we will continue from where we left off the last time. This session we will primarily focus on understanding the other skill type, which is the argument evaluation. Now under argument evaluation we have primarily three testing areas. One is strengthening an argument, the other is weakening the argument, and the third one is finding a flaw in the logic of the argument. Let's first focus on strengthening the argument. Now when we have to strengthen an argument, remember that we are essentially focusing on trying to find that additional premise. When I say additional premise, it's not already there in the argument as such. So we are talking about finding that additional premise that's outside of the argument, but when brought to the context of the argument can give more support to the logic of the argument. So what does that mean? Now this means that we first have to find out the line of reasoning of the argument, and we should be able to identify what assumption the argument has made. Once we understand what assumption the argument has made, then we have to find the evidence, find an evidence from the given answer options that will support that particular assumption. Now going back to our mathematical understanding of how we spot an assumption, we know that we've seen this in the earlier sessions, that we arrived at B relates to C is your assumption. Effectively what we have to do is we have to find evidence that supports this assumption. There are different ways in which your exam can ask you to identify strengthening argument or different ways to identify how to strengthen an argument. Now given on your screen are four different methods or four different variants of the same testing point of strengthening. It's just a different way of asking. Now say for example, first one says which of the following if true most strongly justifies the claim. Now what you need to observe here is one thing very specifically. Now if you look at all the four different variants, all of them have one thing in common, which is the if true part. So since we said that you are trying to bring in additional evidence, it means that this evidence is already not there in the argument. This should not be confused as something that is out of scope of the argument or irrelevant to the argument. Now what we are trying to understand here is this: for strengthening or weakening, we are looking at evidence that already does not exist in the argument, but when brought to the context of the argument, when relevance is given to the context of the argument, then that particular evidence can strengthen or weaken the argument. That's precisely why your question will carry the tag of if true, which means that don't question the answer option for its truth anymore. Take it for granted that the answer options are true, you are just checking how valid they are with respect to the context. That's a very key point that you have to keep in mind. So which of the following if true most justifies the claim? Or say for example, if you look at the third part, it says which of the following if true most strongly supports the argument above. So the different ways of asking the same thing. If you look at weakening the argument part, the approach remains the same. For strengthening and weakening, you first have to spot the logic of the argument, the line of reasoning, and the assumption of the argument. Just as you targeted the assumption of the argument for strengthening and tried to give it more support, here also you will target the assumption of the argument and see what sort of evidence can question the validity of that particular assumption. That's what we do here. Going back to our mathematical representation, we know that B equal to B relates to C is our assumption. Now we have to find evidence that can actually question the logic of B relates to C as such. If we are able to successfully do that, then we have weakened the argument. Weakening simply means lessen the strength. Strength of an argument always lies in its premise, the logic of the argument, which is line of reasoning, and the assumption. So if you target this part, you have successfully weakened an argument. Now there are different ways in which your exam can actually test you or ask you to spot weakening option. One way to do it is obviously ask you which of the following if true most strongly weakens. Another way to do it is what can cast a doubt on the author's logic, or what can undermine the logic of the argument, or what can undermine the conclusion. So different ways of asking the same thing.